story of Norman and
Wake up with
Sylvia
the
Wilkins.
morning light.
If you missed any earlier episodes, please be sure to go back and enjoy them. The
Mountain
Alaska
air,
Diaries is a
chilling
narrated
bite.
true story based on
Got my
first-hand
pack,
journal
I'm
account from
good to go.
1979. Winter had already settled firmly across the Nelchina country. The daylight was shorter now. Frost painted the windows most mornings, and the ponds and sloughs along the road were locked under ice. The dog's breath hung in white clouds at feeding time, and every chore seemed to take a little longer with gloves on. But for me, the biggest event of the season had nothing to do with weather. Sylvia was coming home. She had spent much of the summer in Minnesota visiting the children and their families. It had been good for her. She had enjoyed seeing the kids, spending time with the grandchildren, and catching up with friends and relatives we had not seen in years. Still, the cabin felt empty without her. A person notices those things. You notice an empty chair at supper. You notice when nobody is there to laugh at something funny that happened during the day. You notice when there is nobody to share a cup of coffee with after dark. On the first day of November, the phone finally rang. Back then, phone calls weren't casual things for us. Long-distance calls took planning, and every minute cost money. I answered quickly. "Hello." "Hi there," Sylvia said. Just hearing her voice made me smile. "Well, look who's calling. I figured I ought to check and see if you've burned the place down. I came close twice." She laughed. "No, you didn't." "No, but it sounds more interesting if I say I did." We spent a long time talking that evening. She told me about Minnesota, about the children, about the grandchildren, about family gatherings and church suppers, and all the little things that happen when people live close together. Then she asked the question she always asked. "How are the dogs?" I laughed. I knew that was coming. "Well, they're fine. All of them. More or less." "Norman," I said, "they're fine." She knew me too well. The truth was that dogs, equipment, snow machines, trucks, chainsaws, and cabins were all subjects I could talk about for hours. As we talked, I realized something. When Sylvia first came to Alaska years earlier, she had viewed much of it as a foreign land. Now she spoke about Minnesota as a visitor. Alaska had become home more or less. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not deliberately. But it had happened. A few days later, I drove into Anchorage to pick her up. The road stretched ahead beneath a pale winter sky. The mountains wore fresh snow, and patches of fog clung to low places along the highway. As I drove, I found myself looking forward to hearing all the stories she had saved up. By the time I reached Anchorage, I was nearly as excited as a kid on Christmas morning. When I finally spotted her, she was standing near the terminal with a couple bags at her feet. She waved. I waved back. Then we both started laughing before either of us even said a word. "Well," I said as I loaded her bags, "Minnesota didn't keep you." "No." "Good." The drive back to Nelchina passed quickly. Sylvia talked most of the way. I listened. That arrangement had worked pretty well for many years. She told me stories about the grandchildren, about things the kids were doing, about changes around town, about neighbors, about people asking questions about Alaska. "And what did you tell them?" I asked. "The truth." "That was your first mistake." She laughed. "I told them it was beautiful." "That's better." "And cold." "That's accurate." For a moment, neither of us said anything. Outside the truck window, snow-covered spruce slid past. The Alaska range stood blue-white against the horizon. I knew exactly what she meant. When you've spent enough time in a place, it becomes part of you. Even when life is difficult. Even when winters are long. Even when you're tired of hauling wood and fixing equipment. It becomes home. By the time we reached the cabin, darkness was settling over the country. The dogs immediately announced our arrival. Their barking echoed across the yard. Sylvia smiled. I even missed that. Give it a week. The next several days were spent getting back into the rhythm of Alaskan life. Sylvia threw herself into cleaning and organizing. The cabin had survived my bachelor housekeeping all summer, but just barely. I noticed blankets being folded differently. Things appeared in places where they belonged. Shelves became organized. Boxes disappeared. I wisely stayed out of the way. One morning she stood in the doorway, holding an old coffee can. "Norman." Oh, what is this?" I looked. "No idea." "Yes, you do." I thought for a moment. "Oh, what?" "Carburetor parts." She stared at me. "Why are carburetor parts in the kitchen?" "Safe storage." She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the can. Outside, winter preparations continued. The temperatures dropped below zero. One morning it reached 5 below. Rusty and I spent part of the day moving things from one building to another and working on chainsaw. The next day, I cut stove wood and built dog houses. Winter in Alaska had a way of simplifying priorities. If the wood pile wasn't full, you'd better fill it. If the dogs needed shelter, you'd better build it. If equipment needed repair, you'd better fix it before a storm arrived. Everything else could wait. One morning, Rusty and I loaded the pickup and headed to the woodlot. The cold air bit at our faces as we worked. By noon, we had a good load piled high. Back home, splitting and stacking began. Sylvia stepped outside carrying 2 steaming mugs. Coffee break. Now, that was a phrase worth hearing. We sat on a pile of logs for a few minutes, drinking coffee and looking across the snow-covered country. The sun hung low even in the middle of the day. Winter light in Alaska has a special quality. Everything seems softer somehow, quieter. Looks like another long winter, Sylvia said. They're all long. You always say that. Because it's true. She smiled. I was glad she was back. A few days later, we attended the annual Polak party at Tulsona Lodge. That gathering had become something of a tradition. Nobody seemed entirely sure why it was called the Polak party anymore. It had simply been called that for years. What everyone did know was that there would be food. Lots of food. As we walked inside, warm air rolled over us carrying the smell of roast meats, fresh bread, cabbage dishes, pies, cookies, and things I couldn't immediately identify. The place was packed. Neighbors, hunters, pilots, mechanics, homesteaders, families, people we hadn't seen in months. Norman, hey Sylvia. Voices came from every direction. Someone handed me a paper plate before I'd even taken my coat off. Sylvia disappeared almost immediately into a group of women who were exchanging stories and catching up on news. I knew better than to interrupt. Meanwhile, I found myself discussing snow machines, trapping conditions, and whether the winter would be cold enough to freeze some troublesome overflow areas. Some conversations never change. Later that evening, Sylvia and I sat together watching people visit. Children ran through the crowd. Somebody started singing. A few folks were dancing near one corner of the room. The whole place glowed with warmth. Not bad for the middle of nowhere, Sylvia said. I nodded. Not bad at all. The following Sunday, she tackled laundry while I changed oil in the truck and prepared it for winter. Every vehicle in Alaska needed attention before deep winter arrived. A neglected truck in January could become a very expensive decoration. Later, we drove over to Taslina. As usual, seeing friends turned into an all-day affair. We visited with Lloyd Ronning and Leo Zura. Leo handed us some smoked salmon before we left. Take this with you. Leo, you don't have to. I know. The smoked salmon was excellent. Most Alaska gifts were practical. People shared fish, meat, tools, firewood, help. The older I got, the more I appreciated that. One day we visited Tom and Lisa and then stopped by Dan and Patty's new place. Sylvia wanted to see everything she had missed while she was away. You're becoming a tour guide, she said as we drove. I should charge admission. Nobody would pay. Probably true. Afterward, I spent part of the afternoon helping Max Hoffman install a tank heater on his tractor. He wasn't familiar with the process. When we finished, the Hoffmans handed us 2 dozen eggs and a pair of gloves. That was another Alaska tradition. People helped one another. Then, somehow, everyone ended up trading something before the day was over. As the days passed, winter tightened its grip. Snow machines began appearing more frequently, with smoke curled from chimneys. People talked about trapping seasons, snow conditions, and fuel supplies. The dark arrived earlier every evening. One night, Sylvia and I sat quietly by the stove after supper. Outside, the dogs had settled down. The only sound came from the ticking of the stove as it cooled slightly between loads of wood. Sylvia looked around the cabin. It feels good to be back. It feels good having you back. She smiled. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. The fire glowed softly. Outside, Alaska winter stretched away into darkness. There would be trapping trips ahead, snow machine breakdowns, community gatherings, long cold days, and challenges we couldn't yet see coming. But for now, we were together again, and sometimes that was enough. Part 2. Into the winter country. By the middle of November, my attention was turning toward the trap line. Winter trapping in Alaska isn't something a person decides to do on a whim. There's a lot of preparation involved, and most of it begins long before you ever leave home. Traps need checking and repairing. Snow machines need servicing. Fuel has to be gathered. Food must be packed. Every piece of gear has to earn its place, because once you're out there, there isn't a hardware store around the corner. A forgotten item can become a real problem. For several days, I worked steadily, gathering equipment and organizing supplies. Sylvia watched the growing pile of gear near the door. You planning on moving out there permanently? Thought about it. She rolled her eyes. How many traps do you actually need? All of them. That's what I was afraid you'd say. The truth was, I enjoyed getting ready almost as much as making the trip itself. There was something satisfying about lining up equipment, checking things off mentally, and knowing you were preparing for life in the winter country. One afternoon, I spent extra time splitting kindling. Sylvia noticed. That's more than usual. I know. You worried I'll run out while you're gone? No. She smiled knowingly. You are. Maybe a little. She laughed. I've survived before. Still, the cabin heated with wood, and kindling was worth its weight in gold on cold mornings. I liked knowing she would have plenty stacked nearby while I was away. On the 14th, before my departure, we attended a skating party for Dan Billman's birthday. The gathering took place on a frozen pond that had become a community rink. It was one of those simple events that people remember for years afterward. By the time we arrived, pickup trucks were already parked around the edge of the ice. Headlights and lanterns cast warm pools of light across the snow. The temperature was cold enough to keep everyone's breath hanging in the air, but not so cold that people stayed home. Children raced across the ice like they had springs in their legs. Teenagers skated in circles, pretending not to notice one another while carefully noticing one another. Several older folks stood around a barrel fire drinking coffee and exchanging stories. Someone had brought a portable radio. Country music drifted out into the cold evening. Dan was standing near the fire when we arrived. Happy birthday, I said. Thanks. How old are you now? Old enough not to answer that question. Sylvia laughed. Smart man. Before long, somebody produced a birthday cake. Nobody seemed concerned that it wasn't perfectly decorated. The important thing was that it tasted good. And it did. Children skated until their cheeks glowed bright red from the cold. Parents visited. Friends caught up on news. Several of the younger boys challenged each other to races across the rink. One of them wiped out spectacularly and slid halfway across the ice. Everyone laughed, including him. At one point, Sylvia tugged on my sleeve. Come on. Where? We're skating. No, we're not. Yes, we are. I haven't had skates on in years. Then it's time. A few minutes later, I found myself wobbling across the ice while several children found the entire situation highly entertaining. One little girl skated past me effortlessly. You're slow. Thank you. She grinned and disappeared. Sylvia wasn't much better than I was, but she laughed the entire time. That's one thing I always appreciated about her. She didn't need expensive entertainment. A frozen pond, good friends, and a little laughter were enough. Looking back now, those gatherings were important. Life in rural Alaska could be isolated. People worked hard. Winters were long. Events like that skating party reminded everyone that they belonged to a community. Long after the birthday cake was gone and the lanterns were packed away, I would still remember the sight of neighbors laughing together beneath a sky full of stars. The next morning, I turned my attention back to the trap line. I drove out to look over the 11-mile trail and another trail farther up the Lake Louise Road. Snow conditions were still a little uncertain, and I wanted to see what I would be dealing with. That day, Patty's brother John gave me 2 dogs named Fluffy and Smokey. The names didn't exactly strike fear into the hearts of wild animals, but they seemed like good dogs. By the 16th, everything was finally ready. The temperature had dropped to 25 below zero, cold enough that every breath reminded you that winter had truly arrived. I got up early and loaded gear onto the truck. Snow machine, fuel, food, traps, tools, sleeping gear, everything I would need. Ken was joining me for the trip. His wife Jackie dropped him off and planned to pick him up when he came out a few days later. Neither of us knew then just how much effort it would take simply to reach the cabin. We unloaded at Jan's place along the Lake Louise Road. After saying goodbye to Jackie, Ken and I started up the snow machines. The first several miles followed an old seismic trail. Travel wasn't bad there. After that, things became considerably more interesting. We left the established trail and began breaking our own route through fresh snow. The country ahead was untouched. Every mile had to be earned. The machines worked hard. So did we. One steep hill nearly stopped us entirely. I remember looking up at it and thinking that it didn't appear nearly as steep from the bottom. That illusion disappeared quickly. Ken charged first. Halfway up, the machine bogged down. Snow flew everywhere. The engine roared. The sled behind him tried to pull him backward. Eventually, he fought his way to the top. Then it was my turn. I was hauling a particularly heavy load. At one point, I wasn't entirely sure whether the machine was moving forward or simply digging a hole. When I finally reached the top, I climbed off, breathing hard. Kim was laughing. Having fun? No. Looks like fun. Looks can be deceiving. The daylight began fading earlier than we liked. That happens quickly in Alaska during November. One moment you think you have plenty of time. The next moment darkness is approaching. As evening drew closer, I started feeling the pressure. I knew the cabin was nearby. The problem was that nearby, in wilderness country, can still cover a lot of ground. The snow had changed the appearance of everything. Landmarks looked different. Brush looked different. Even familiar ridges seemed unfamiliar. Ken continued breaking trail ahead of me. I watched him disappear among the trees and reappear again. Then suddenly we emerged into a more open area. I stopped. Something clicked. I recognized it immediately. Relief washed over me. I knew exactly where we were. The cabin wasn't far away. I tried shouting to Ken. The engine noise swallowed my voice. He kept going. I waved. Still nothing. Finally, he stopped nearly 100 yards away and turned around. I pointed toward the trees. There, he nodded. A few minutes later, we rolled into the cabin clearing just as darkness settled across the country. I've never been happier to see a pile of split firewood. The cabin stood exactly as I'd left it. Solid, dry, waiting. Inside, the temperature felt nearly the same as outdoors. The first order of business was obvious. Fire. Soon kindling crackled inside the stove. Flames grew stronger. Heat slowly spread through the room. There are few pleasures greater than warming up a frozen cabin after a long winter journey. The sound of the stove, the smell of wood smoke, steam beginning to rise from a kettle. Those things feel almost magical after hours in the cold. Before long, we had water heating and coffee brewing. Ken sat near the stove, rubbing his hands together. This is a pretty nice setup. I smiled. I thought you might like it. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it was home when I was out there. A person didn't need luxury in the bush. They needed shelter, warmth, and a place to dry their socks. Supper that evening was chili. Not just any chili either. I had frozen it ahead of time and packed it in specifically for this trip. Soon the cabin smelled wonderful. Spices, tomatoes, meat, coffee, with smoke. The combination could make a hungry man weak in the knees. We finished the first pot quickly. Very quickly. I noticed Ken still looking hopeful afterward. Hungry. Maybe. So am I. Fortunately, I had planned ahead. Another package of chili came out. By the time we finished the second helping, neither one of us was interested in food anymore. We sat back in our chairs, completely satisfied. Now that's living, Ken declared. Outside, the temperature settled somewhere between 12 and 15 below zero. Inside, the cabin glowed with lantern light. The stove radiated comforting heat. For a while we talked about trapping, then hunting, then cabins, then Alaska. Eventually conversation drifted into comfortable silence. Those are the best kinds of friendships. The ones that don't require constant talking. Later that evening, while Ken looked around the cabin, I worked on a small trap carrier for the snow machine. Even in a remote cabin, there is always something useful to build. Before turning in, I stepped outside one last time. The cold hit immediately. Above me stretched a sky crowded with stars. Earlier that day, we had seen something unusual. A faint rainbow-like arc high in the winter sky. One of those strange atmospheric displays that appear only under certain conditions. Even after all my years in Alaska, things like that still caught my attention. The wilderness never entirely runs out of surprises. The next morning dawned clear and cold. 10 below. Perfect weather for staying close to the stove. Instead, we got up and went to work. First, though, breakfast. I introduced Ken to one of my favorite cabin meals. Bannock. Simple food. Flour. Lard. Baking powder. A little know-how. I mixed the dough while Ken watched. Then I placed it into a small cast-iron skillet. Another skillet served as the lid. The whole thing sat atop the stove, slowly baking. The cabin filled with the smell of fresh bread. When one side browned, I carefully flipped it. Soon it was ready. Hot bannock, fresh butter, strong coffee. Breakfast didn't get much better than that. Ken took one bite, then another. "This is good." "Told you." "No, this is really good." I laughed. There is something about fresh bannock in a winter cabin that makes a person feel rich regardless of how much money they have. After breakfast, we prepared to part ways. Ken's trip was ending. Mine was just beginning. I accompanied him partway back toward the seismic trail to make sure he had no problems finding the route out. When we stopped, we shook hands. "Thanks for bringing me out here. Glad you came." He looked back toward the country we had crossed. "I understand now why you keep returning." I nodded. Most people do once they see it. Then he headed toward the road, and I turned back toward the cabin. The wilderness quickly swallowed the sound of his machine. Before long, I was alone again. Just me, the snow, the trapline, and another Alaska winter waiting to unfold. Part 3, Alone on the Trapline. After seeing Ken safely headed toward the road, I turned my snow machine back toward Blue Lake and settled into the kind of quiet that only exists in the Alaska bush. The wilderness has a different sound when you're alone. When another person is with you, there is always conversation, even if it comes only now and then. There is another set of tracks in the snow. Another machine parked outside the cabin. Another cup drying beside the stove. Once Ken left, all of that disappeared. It was just me again. Truth be told, I enjoyed that. Not because I dislike people. Quite the opposite. I enjoyed visiting with friends and neighbors as much as anyone. But there is something about being alone in the winter country that clears a person's mind. The problems of everyday life seem smaller. The noise disappears. You pay attention to things that would otherwise go unnoticed. A distant raven, the sound of ice shifting beneath snow, the shape of mountains far away, the direction of the wind. The cabin felt different when I returned that afternoon. Not lonely, just quiet. I put fresh wood in the stove and hung my coat near the heat. Then I fixed a simple supper. A ptarmigan I'd managed to get while traveling that day. Not a large bird, but fresh meat always tastes good in the bush. As darkness settled outside, I lit the Coleman lantern. Its familiar glow filled the cabin. The shadows danced softly against the log walls. I spent part of the evening reading and sharpening a knife. The old airtight stove steadily consumed wood and kept the place comfortable. By bedtime, the cabin felt warm and secure. Outside, winter stretched in every direction. Inside, life was good. The next morning dawned cold. 18 below. A little ice fog hung in the low places. I moved slower than usual getting started. Some mornings a man discovers muscles he didn't know he had. The trail breaking with Ken had left me stiff and sore. Even so, there was work to do. Traps don't set themselves. I headed out to the south and west of Blue Lake. The country there rolled gently through ridges, scattered timber, frozen ponds, and open stretches where a person could see a long way. As always, I watched the snow. Snow tells stories. A trapper learns to read it. There were moose tracks, caribou tracks, fox tracks, a few marten tracks, rabbit sign here and there. Evidence of life was everywhere, even when the animals themselves remained hidden. I found a place that looked promising for an otter set and spent some time preparing it. Nearby, I made several fox and marten sets. The work itself wasn't especially exciting. Trapping rarely looks dramatic. It is a matter of observation, patience, and persistence. But there was satisfaction in it. Each trap represented possibility. Each trail opened another piece of country. As afternoon slipped toward evening, the ice fog began thickening. The temperature dropped again. I could see my breath hanging in the still air. By the time I returned to the cabin, frost covered much of my parka. After supper, I sat with a notebook and made a few observations. One thing stood out. There wasn't enough snow yet for truly good snowmobiling. The trails remained rough. Every trip felt like a wrestling match with the machine. Still, winter was young. There would be more snow. There always was. The following day brought 20 below temperatures. I slept later than usual. The previous days had caught up with me. When I finally stepped outside, the cold felt sharp enough to bite. The world sparkled beneath bright sunlight. Every spruce branch seemed coated in diamonds. It was beautiful, cold enough to freeze your nose, but beautiful. That day, I broke another trap trail. North, then east, then south, making a large loop before eventually returning home. I added more sets along the way. Again, I found signs of foxes and marten. Again, the animals themselves stayed hidden. That's often how it goes. The wilderness reveals itself slowly. One thing I remember particularly from that day was a small lake. It wasn't marked on any map I carried, just a quiet little lake tucked among the hills. The snow lay untouched across its surface. The spruce reflected darkly along the shoreline. There wasn't another track anywhere. I shut off the snow machine and simply stood there for a few minutes. No wind, no engines, no voices, nothing, just silence. People often ask what draws someone back into remote country year after year. Moments like that are a part of the answer. The days settled into a rhythm. Breakfast. Check the weather. Gather gear. Run traps. Look for fresh sign. Return to the cabin. Cut wood. Cook supper. Read. Sleep. Repeat. Simple, but satisfying. One afternoon, I decided to tackle a project that had been bothering me. The cabin's ceiling needed insulation. The previous winter, I had noticed how much heat escaped through the roof. Now I had both the materials and the time. It took about 2.5 hours. Nothing complicated, just steady work. By the time I finished, I could already tell the difference. The cabin held heat noticeably better. That evening, I burned less wood than usual. A small improvement perhaps, but in the bush, small improvements matter. Every stick of firewood saved represents less work later. I celebrated by sharpening knives and enjoying another peaceful evening by the stove. Sometimes a good day is simply one where things work. The weather moderated slightly over the next couple of days. 10 below one morning, 0 at noon another. Bright sunshine, no wind, beautiful weather for traveling. One day, I measured the ice on the lake near the cabin. 13 inches thick, strong enough that I felt comfortable using it as part of my route. The country looked especially clear from some of the higher ridges nearby. I climbed one of them and spent several minutes studying the landscape. That's something I always enjoyed. Learning country, really learning it. Not just following a trail. Knowing where the ridges connect. Knowing which lakes drain where. Knowing what mountain belongs on which horizon. A person who understands a country rarely gets lost. At least not for very long. From that ridge, I could see distant peaks gleaming in the sunlight. The view stretched for miles. Not another person anywhere. Just Alaska. I remember thinking how fortunate I was. Not rich, not famous, not important, but fortunate. Very fortunate. On the 23rd, I ran both trap lines. Again, no fur. That can be frustrating. A trapper always hopes for results. Still, disappointment comes with the territory. You keep working. You keep adjusting. Eventually, things change. That day, I spotted a cow moose and her calf. They moved quietly through the timber, feeding as they went. Watching them reminded me how much life survives these winters. The conditions can seem harsh to us. To the animals, it is simply another season. By evening, I noticed something else. Overflow. Water pushing up through the ice beneath the snow. That can create real problems for snow machine travel. I made a mental note to be careful. The following morning, I decided it was time to head out to the road. The trip took about 2 hours. Along the way, I counted 32 caribou. 32. Some grazing, some traveling, others simply standing and watching me pass. I've never grown tired of seeing caribou. They belong to this country in a way that's difficult to describe. When I reached Jan's place, I met Jay, Jan's father. We talked for a while before I continued on. It felt strange being around people again after several days alone. Not unpleasant, just different. The pace changes. The silence disappears. Life becomes social again. That evening, I found myself back among friends and neighbors. We visited the Hoffmans, met a fellow named George who worked in radio. His family was there as well. Before long stories were being exchanged around the table, coffee cups refilled, laughter drifted through the room. The sort of evening that seemed entirely ordinary at the time. Yet years later, those are often the memories that remain. The next day brought fresh snow, 2 inches overnight. Charlie stopped by to talk about dogs. He was interested in running some of mine. We stood outside discussing the matter while our breath formed clouds in the cold air. These dogs have potential, he said. Potential to eat a lot. They already do that. Exactly. He laughed. The truth was that dog teams fascinated me. I admired people who could train them properly. At that point, I simply didn't have enough time to devote to it. The trapline already demanded plenty. So did everything else. Afterward, Sylvia and I made a supply run into Glen Allen. Winter always seems to consume more supplies than expected. Groceries, fuel, hardware. Something is always needed. As we drove home that evening, darkness settling around us, Sylvia asked how the trapping had been. Slow. No luck. Not much. She smiled. You'll keep going? Of course. Why? I thought about it for a moment. Because it wasn't really about catching fur. Not entirely. It was about the country, the cabin, the challenge, the independence, the feeling of being part of the land instead of merely passing through it. Hard to explain, I finally said. She nodded. I think I understand. And she did. By then she understood Alaska almost as well as I did. Ahead of us, Thanksgiving was approaching. Beyond that, new adventures waited. There was still the Green Acres trip, the dream of owning a piece of wilderness land. And before winter was over, there would be challenges neither of us could yet imagine. But for the moment, Sylvia was home. The cabin was warm. The snow was deepening. And another chapter of our Alaska life was unfolding exactly as it should.
Sunrise creeping over Denali's Peak, got the frost on the window pane. Ain't no time for another hour's sleep. Hear that wild calling out my name. Oh, the mountains are my home, the river is my guide. Got a soul that's running free and a heart that's open wide. From the Yukon to the sea, this is where I'm meant to be. In the land of the midnight sun, wild and free. Saw a grizzly with her cubs just the other day, down by the salmon running strong. Gave a friendly nod and went on my own way, humming an old campfire song. Oh, the mountains are my home, the river is my guide. Got a soul that's running free and a heart that's open wide. From the Yukon to the sea, this is where I'm meant to be.